In the summer of 1987, three sisters who worked as flight attendants for Pacific Airlines disappeared without a trace during what should have been a routine layover in Portland, Oregon. For 17 years, their families searched for answers, clinging to hope that somewhere, somehow, the Henderson sisters were still alive. Then in 2004, a construction crew digging the foundation for a new shopping center made a discovery that would shatter everything the world thought it knew about their disappearance. Sarah Henderson was 28, the oldest of the three sisters, and a senior flight attendant with Pacific Airlines. She was known for her warm smile and her ability to calm even the most nervous passengers during turbulence. Her colleagues described her as the kind of person who would give you the shirt off her back, someone who never missed a birthday or forgot to check on a friend going through a rough time. Michelle Henderson, 25, was the middle sister and had been flying for Pacific Airlines for 3 years. She was studying for her pilot's license in her spare time, dreaming of one day becoming the first female captain in the airline's history. Her logbooks were filled with meticulous notes about weather patterns and flight procedures, evidence of her dedication to mastering every aspect of aviation. The youngest sister, Jennifer Henderson, was just 22 and had only been working as a flight attendant for 8 months. She was saving money to go back to school, planning to become a nurse like their mother had been. Jennifer was known for her infectious laugh and her habit of leaving little encouraging notes in the seat pockets for passengers who looked like they were having a difficult day. The three sisters lived together in a small apartment near the airport, sharing everything from groceries to dreams of traveling the world together. They had grown up in a tight-knit family in Sacramento, California, where their mother had raised them as a single parent after their father died in a car accident when Jennifer was only 7 years old. Their bond was unbreakable, forged through years of looking out for each other and supporting their mother through the hardest times of their lives. On July 15th, 1987, the Henderson sisters were scheduled to work Flight 447 from San Francisco to Portland, a routine 2-hour trip they had flown together dozens of times before. The flight departed on schedule at 6:30 in the morning, carrying 93 passengers and a crew of 6. According to the flight manifest, the sisters were supposed to have a 12-hour layover in Portland before working the return flight to San Francisco the following morning. The flight landed safely at Portland International Airport at 8:45 a.m. Pacific Time. Passengers disembarked without incident, and the crew completed their post-flight procedures normally. Security cameras in the terminal captured the Henderson sisters walking through the concourse together at 9:15 a.m., pulling their standard black rolling suitcases and chatting animatedly about something that made Jennifer laugh. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. According to their supervisor, the sisters had checked into the Pacific Airlines crew hotel by 10 a.m. and were scheduled to report for duty the next morning at 7 a.m. for their return flight. But when 7 a.m. came, the Henderson sisters were nowhere to be found. Their hotel rooms showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. Their suitcases were neatly packed, their uniforms hanging in the closets, their personal belongings exactly where they should have been. The first indication that something was wrong came when the sisters failed to answer their wake-up calls. Hotel staff knocked on their doors, repeatedly before using master keys to enter the rooms. Finding the rooms empty but undisturbed, they immediately contacted Pacific Airlines operations. Within an hour, the airline had notified local police, who began treating the case as a missing persons investigation. The initial search was extensive. Portland police canvassed the hotel and surrounding area, interviewing employees and reviewing security footage from nearby businesses. The FBI was called in after 24 hours, given the interstate nature of the case and the potential for foul play. Search teams combed the Columbia River and surrounding forests, while investigators tracked down every person the sisters had interacted with during their layover. But despite hundreds of interviews, thousands of tips, and countless hours of investigation, no trace of the Henderson sisters was ever found. Their mother, Patricia Henderson, flew to Portland immediately and spent weeks walking the streets, hanging flyers with their photographs, and pleading with anyone who would listen to help find her daughters. She offered a reward that started at $10,000 and eventually grew to $50,000 as the months passed without answers. The case generated significant media attention throughout the Pacific Northwest and California. The story of three beautiful young flight attendants who had simply vanished captured the public imagination and spawned countless theories. Some believed the sisters had been kidnapped by human traffickers. Others suspected they had been murdered by someone they met during their layover. A few conspiracy theorists even suggested the sisters had been recruited by foreign intelligence agencies or had assumed new identities to escape some unknown threat. As the months turned into years, the active investigation gradually wound down. The FBI kept the case open, but with no new leads or evidence, there was little more they could do. Patricia Henderson never stopped searching, hiring private investigators and following up on every tip that came her way. She appeared on television shows, spoke at conferences for families of missing persons, and maintained a website dedicated to finding her daughters. The Pacific Airlines flight crew community was devastated by the disappearance. Fellow flight attendants organized search parties, raised money for the reward fund, and kept the sisters' photographs posted in crew lounges across the country. Many of their colleagues reported having dreams about the sisters, imagining them stranded somewhere, waiting to be rescued. The airline eventually retired their employee numbers and established a scholarship fund in their names for aspiring aviation professionals. Local law enforcement in Portland continued to receive occasional tips about the Henderson sisters throughout the years. Someone would claim to have seen them working at a restaurant in another state or living under assumed names in a small town somewhere. Each lead was dutifully investigated, but none ever led to any concrete evidence. The sisters had simply vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. By the late 1990s, the case had largely faded from public memory. Newer missing persons cases captured media attention, and the Henderson sisters became just another cold case file gathering dust in a police department storage room. Their mother continued her search, but even she began to accept that she might never learn what happened to her daughters. She moved to Portland permanently, unable to bear the thought of being far away if they ever returned. In the spring of 2004, a development company broke ground on a new shopping center in a suburb of Portland called Hillsboro. The site had been vacant for decades, an overgrown lot that had once housed a small manufacturing plant. Construction crews arrived in March to begin excavation for the foundation, expecting nothing more challenging than the usual rocks and tree roots that plagued most building projects in the Pacific Northwest. What they found instead would reopen one of the most baffling missing persons cases in Oregon history and raise questions that continue to haunt investigators to this day. The discovery was made on a gray Tuesday morning in early May when a backhoe operator named Dave Morrison was digging a trench for the building's foundation. His machine hit something that felt different from the usual soil and debris, something that made a distinctive clanking sound against the metal bucket. Morrison shut off his equipment and climbed down to investigate. What he found, buried approximately 6 feet underground, would send shockwaves through the Portland Police Bureau and reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Wrapped in plastic sheeting and preserved by the cool, damp Oregon soil were 3 Pacific Airlines flight attendant uniforms, complete with name tags that read Henderson. The uniforms were in remarkably good condition, considering they had been buried for 17 years. The navy blue fabric showed some discoloration, and the metal buttons had tarnished, but the distinctive Pacific Airlines logo was still clearly visible on the jacket lapels. More disturbing than the uniforms themselves was what was found with them, personal items that investigators immediately recognized from the original missing persons report. Sarah's watch, a silver Timex that her mother had given her for graduation from flight attendant training, was wrapped carefully inside her uniform jacket. Michelle's pilot training manual, which she had carried everywhere during her studies, was sealed in a separate plastic bag. Jennifer's favorite lipstick, a bright red shade she had worn on her last day of work, was tucked into the pocket of her uniform skirt. The construction site was immediately cordoned off as a crime scene. FBI agents who had worked the original case were called back from retirement, and a new task force was assembled to re-examine every piece of evidence from 1987. The media descended on Hillsborough like a swarm, transforming the quiet suburb into a circus of reporters, camera crews, and curiosity seekers hoping to catch a glimpse of the investigation. Patricia Henderson, now in her 70s but still sharp and determined, was notified of the discovery within hours. She arrived at the scene that afternoon, her face a mask of hope and terror as she watched investigators carefully excavate the area around where her daughter's uniforms had been found. For the first time in 17 years, she had concrete evidence that something terrible had happened to her girls. The discovery of the uniforms raised more questions than it answered. How had they ended up buried in a vacant lot in Hillsborough, miles from where the sisters had last been seen? Why were only the uniforms found and not the sisters themselves? Who had buried them, and why had they chosen this particular location? Most importantly, if the uniforms were here, where were Sarah, Michelle, and Jennifer Henderson? The forensic team worked methodically through the damp Oregon soil, expanding their search grid in careful increments. Every shovelful of dirt was sifted through screens, every fragment examined under magnifying glasses. The investigation consumed the entire vacant lot, transforming what had been destined to become a shopping center into the largest crime scene Portland had witnessed in decades. Within 72 hours, the search yielded additional evidence that deepened the mystery. Buried approximately 20 feet from the uniforms, investigators discovered a leather handbag that Patricia Henderson immediately identified as belonging to Sarah. Inside the purse, protected by the same plastic wrapping that had preserved the uniforms, were Sarah's driver's license, credit cards, and a small address book filled with phone numbers of friends and family members. The handbag contained something else that made investigators' blood run cold. Tucked into a zippered compartment was a handwritten note on Pacific Airlines stationery. The message was brief but chilling. If something happens to us, look for the man with the scar. He knows about the flights. The handwriting was confirmed to be Sarah's through comparison with employment records and personal letters. FBI behavioral analysts studied the note for hours, debating its meaning and significance. What flights was Sarah referring to? Who was the man with the scar? Most disturbing of all, the note suggested that Sarah had anticipated danger, that she had known something might happen to her and her sisters. But if she had been afraid, why hadn't she contacted police or confided in anyone about her concerns? Detective Ray Kowalski, who had been a rookie officer during the original investigation, was now leading the renewed search effort. He spent long nights poring over the 1987 case files, looking for any mention of a man with a scar or anything that might explain Sarah's cryptic warning. The original investigation had been thorough, but 17 years of technological advances meant evidence could now be analyzed in ways that hadn't been possible in the 80s. The plastic sheeting that had protected the uniforms and personal items became a crucial piece of evidence. Chemical analysis revealed that the plastic was manufactured by a company in Vancouver, Washington, just across the Columbia River from Portland. The plastic had been produced in a specific batch during the summer of 1987, narrowing the timeline for when the items had been buried. More intriguingly, the plastic contained microscopic fibers that didn't match any of the Henderson sisters' clothing or belongings. The fibers were consistent with industrial work clothes, suggesting that whoever had buried the evidence had been wearing coveralls or similar protective garments. This detail painted a picture of someone who had planned the burial carefully, someone who understood the importance of avoiding contamination. As news of the discoveries spread, tips began pouring into the Portland Police Bureau. Residents of Hillsborough recalled seeing unusual activity in the vacant lot during the late 80s. An elderly woman named Rose Martinez remembered seeing a man digging in the area during the summer of 1987, shortly after the Henderson sisters had disappeared. She had assumed he was doing some kind of utility work and hadn't thought much of it at the time. Martinez's description of the man was frustratingly vague. She remembered that he was tall and wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Most significantly, she recalled that he had what appeared to be a prominent scar running along his left cheek. Her account sent a surge of excitement through the investigation team, as it seemed to corroborate Sarah's written warning about the man with the scar. The renewed investigation also uncovered disturbing information about Pacific Airlines' operations during the summer of 1987. Former employees came forward with stories about irregularities in flight schedules, unusual cargo manifests, and mysterious passengers who seemed to have connections to airline management. Several flight attendants reported being asked to work unscheduled flights with minimal documentation, trips that weren't recorded in official airline records. Jennifer's former roommate from flight attendant training, Lisa Chen, revealed that Jennifer had called her just 2 days before the disappearance. During that conversation, Jennifer had seemed unusually nervous and mentioned that she and her sisters had been assigned to work some special flights that made her uncomfortable. When Lisa had pressed for details, Jennifer had been evasive, saying only that the passengers on these flights weren't typical travelers and that the sisters had been instructed not to ask questions about their destinations or cargo. The investigations expanded to include a thorough examination of Pacific Airlines' financial records from 1987. What investigators discovered suggested that the airline had been struggling financially and may have been involved in activities that went far beyond commercial passenger service. Bank records showed large cash deposits that couldn't be accounted for through normal operations, and several flights had been chartered by shell companies that appeared to exist only on paper. Most disturbing of all, investigators found evidence that Pacific Airlines had been operating flights that weren't recorded in official FAA logs. These phantom flights appeared to have been primarily cargo runs, moving packages and occasionally passengers between small airports along the West Coast. The Henderson sisters' names appeared on crew manifests for several of these mysterious flights in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. The connection between these irregular flights and the sisters' disappearance became clearer when investigators located Marcus Webb, a former Pacific Airlines pilot who had left the company abruptly in August 1987, just weeks after the Henderson sisters vanished. Webb had moved to Alaska and spent the intervening years working for small charter operations in remote areas. When FBI agents finally tracked him down in Anchorage, he was reluctant to discuss his time with Pacific Airlines. Under pressure from federal investigators, Webb eventually revealed that Pacific Airlines had been involved in smuggling operations during the mid-80s. The airline was being used to transport drugs and other contraband between Mexico and various cities along the West Coast. The Henderson sisters, according to Webb, had inadvertently discovered evidence of these illegal activities during one of their regular flights. Webb explained that flight attendants were occasionally asked to deliver sealed envelopes to specific individuals in airport terminals, told that these were urgent business documents that couldn't be delayed. The sisters had been performing these deliveries for months without suspicion until Sarah had accidentally opened one of the envelopes and discovered that it contained detailed information about drug shipments and payment schedules. According to Webb's account, Sarah had confronted airline management about what she had found, threatening to report the illegal activities to federal authorities. The conversation had taken place in the Pacific Airlines operations office just 3 days before the sisters' scheduled flight to Portland. Webb claimed that he had overheard part of the argument and had seen Sarah leave the office, visibly shaken and frightened. The pilot's testimony provided crucial context for Sarah's handwritten warning about the man with the scar. Webb identified this individual as Vincent Torino, a Pacific Airlines executive who handled special operations for the airline. Torino was known for his violent temper and his distinctive facial scar, the result of a knife fight during his younger years in Chicago. He had disappeared from Portland around the same time as the Henderson sisters, and his whereabouts had remained unknown since 1987. FBI agents immediately began searching for any trace of Vincent Torino, running his name through every database available. What they discovered painted a picture of a dangerous man with connections to organized crime families in Chicago and Los Angeles. Torino had a lengthy criminal record dating back to the 1960s, including arrests for assault, extortion, and suspected involvement in several unsolved murders. The investigation took on new urgency as agents realized they might be dealing with not just a missing persons case, but potentially a triple homicide connected to organized crime. The burial of the uniforms and personal items suggested that whoever was responsible wanted the Henderson sisters to be remembered, but also wanted to ensure that their bodies would never be found. As summer turned to fall in 2004, the search expanded beyond the original construction site. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan adjacent properties, and cadaver dogs were brought in to search for any trace of human remains. The investigation consumed enormous resources and attracted national media attention, but despite months of intensive searching, no additional evidence was discovered. Patricia Henderson watched the investigation unfold with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. After 17 years of uncertainty, she finally had confirmation that her daughters had been victims of a crime, but she was no closer to finding their remains or seeing justice served. The discovery of their uniforms and personal items felt like a cruel tease, offering just enough information to reopen old wounds while providing no real closure. The case began to consume Detective Kowalski's every waking moment. He studied crime scene photos until his eyes burned, interviewed and re-interviewed every person connected to the Henderson sisters, and followed leads that stretched from Portland to Los Angeles to Chicago. The more he learned about Vincent Torino and Pacific Airlines' illegal operations, the more convinced he became that the sisters had been murdered to prevent them from exposing the smuggling ring. But Torino's trail had gone cold decades ago, and finding him seemed increasingly impossible. The man had vanished as completely as the Henderson sisters themselves, leaving behind only whispers and rumors in the criminal underworld. Kowalski reached out to FBI field offices across the country, hoping someone might have information about Torino's current whereabouts or even confirmation of his death. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In November 2004, a former Chicago police detective named Frank Russo contacted the Portland FBI office after seeing news coverage of the Henderson case. Russo had been investigating organized crime connections in the Midwest during the late 80s and remembered Vincent Torino as a mid-level enforcer who had worked for several criminal organizations. According to Russo, Torino had a reputation for making problems disappear permanently. He was known in Chicago circles as someone who could handle delicate situations that required both violence and careful cleanup. Russo recalled that Torino had bragged about a job on the West Coast in 1987, claiming he had eliminated some troublesome witnesses who had threatened to expose a lucrative operation. Russo's information painted a chilling picture of what might have happened to the Henderson sisters. If Torino had been ordered to silence them, he would have planned their disappearance carefully, ensuring that their bodies would never be found while leaving just enough evidence to send a message to other potential witnesses. The burial of their uniforms fit this pattern perfectly. The investigation team decided to focus their efforts on finding Vincent Torino, believing he held the key to solving the Henderson case. They created a detailed timeline of his known associates and activities, tracking his movements through criminal records and surveillance reports from multiple law enforcement agencies. The search revealed that Torino had maintained connections to organized crime families in several major cities throughout the 80s and 90s. In December 2004, agents received a tip from an informant in Las Vegas who claimed to have seen Torino working security for a casino operation in the early 90s. The informant, a former bookmaker named Tommy Castellano, said Torino had aged considerably and was using the name Vincent Torres, but the distinctive scar made him instantly recognizable. FBI agents flew to Las Vegas immediately, but their investigation hit another dead end. Casino employment records showed that a Vincent Torres had indeed worked security from 1991 to 1994, but he had left the job abruptly, and his forwarding address led to an abandoned apartment complex. Neighbors remembered him as a quiet man who kept to himself and seemed to be looking over his shoulder constantly. The Las Vegas lead provided one crucial piece of information. A former casino manager recalled that Torres had often talked about eventually retiring to Mexico, where he claimed to have property and connections that would keep him safe from his past. This information prompted the FBI to coordinate with Mexican authorities, though the prospects of finding Torino across the border seemed slim. Meanwhile, the investigation into Pacific Airlines' illegal operations continued to reveal disturbing details about the extent of the smuggling network. Former employees came forward with stories about mysterious cargo shipments, unusual flight patterns, and passengers who boarded planes without going through normal security procedures. The airline had essentially been operating as a front for criminal organizations, using legitimate passenger flights to mask their illegal activities. Detective Kowalski interviewed Maria Santos, a former Pacific Airlines gate agent who had worked the night shift during the summer of 1987. Santos revealed that she had been instructed to process certain passengers differently, allowing them to board planes without proper documentation or baggage screening. These special passengers were always accompanied by airline employees who seemed more like security guards than customer service representatives. Santos remembered the Henderson sisters because they had asked her about the unusual procedures on several occasions. Sarah, in particular, had seemed troubled by what she witnessed and had questioned why certain passengers received preferential treatment. Santos had warned Sarah to mind her own business, telling her that asking too many questions could be dangerous for her career. The gate agent's testimony provided additional context for Sarah's growing concerns in the weeks before her disappearance. It became clear that the sisters had gradually become aware of the illegal activities surrounding them, and their questions had likely marked them as potential threats to the smuggling operation. As 2005 began, the investigation expanded to include a review of unsolved murders and disappearances along the West Coast during the late 80s. Investigators theorized that the Henderson sisters might not have been Torino's only victims, and that other witnesses or employees who had discovered the smuggling operation might have met similar fates. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Between 1986 and 1988, at least 6 Pacific Airlines employees had died under suspicious circumstances or had disappeared without explanation. A baggage handler in Los Angeles had been found dead in his apartment, apparently the victim of a robbery that had left his expensive electronics untouched. A flight attendant based in San Francisco had vanished during a layover in Phoenix, leaving behind her purse and identification in her hotel room. Each case had been investigated separately by local authorities, but no one had connected them to the broader pattern of criminal activity at Pacific Airlines. The deaths and disappearances had been spread across multiple jurisdictions, making it difficult for investigators to recognize the common thread. Only now, with the benefit of hindsight and access to all the case files, did the scope of the conspiracy become clear. FBI profilers studying the cases concluded that the Henderson sisters had likely been murdered within hours of their disappearance from the Portland hotel. Their bodies had probably been disposed of in a remote location, possibly weighted down and dumped in the Columbia River or buried in the vast forests surrounding Portland. The killer had then taken their uniforms and personal items to the burial site in Hillsborough, creating a deliberate message for anyone else who might consider exposing the operation. The choice of burial location wasn't random. The vacant lot in Hillsborough had been owned by a shell company with connections to organized crime, and the property had remained undeveloped for decades after the burial. Investigators theorized that Torino had specifically chosen this location because he knew it would remain undisturbed, at least until the criminal organization decided it was safe to develop the land. Patricia Henderson followed every development in the investigation with a mixture of hope and dread. Each new revelation brought her closer to understanding what had happened to her daughters, but also made it increasingly clear that they had been victims of a calculated murder. She found some comfort in knowing that Sarah had tried to do the right thing by threatening to expose the criminal activity, even though that decision had ultimately cost all three sisters their lives. The media attention surrounding the case brought forward additional witnesses who had been afraid to speak in 1987. A hotel maintenance worker revealed that he had seen 3 women being escorted from the Pacific Airlines crew hotel by 2 men in suits on the morning of the disappearance. He had assumed they were airline employees handling some kind of emergency, but now realized he might have witnessed the sisters' kidnapping. The maintenance worker's description of the men matched known associates of Vincent Torino, lending credibility to the theory that the sisters had been taken from their hotel and murdered shortly afterward. Security cameras from 1987 had long since been destroyed, making it impossible to verify his account, but his testimony provided investigators with a clearer timeline of the sisters' final hours. As spring arrived in 2005, the investigation faced increasing pressure to produce results. The media attention had begun to fade, and FBI resources were being redirected to more recent cases. Detective Kowalski found himself fighting to keep the Henderson case active, arguing that they were closer than ever to solving a crime that had haunted Portland for nearly 2 decades. The detective's persistence paid off when Mexican authorities reported a possible sighting of Vincent Torino in a small coastal town south of Tijuana. A local police officer had recognized the distinctive scar and reported seeing an elderly American man who matched Torino's description living quietly in a beachfront cottage. The man had been using yet another assumed name and had paid cash for everything, avoiding any official documentation that might reveal his true identity. FBI agents coordinated with Mexican law enforcement to investigate the sighting, but their efforts were hampered by jurisdictional complications and the remote location of the cottage. By the time authorities reached the property, it had been abandoned for several weeks. Neighbors reported that the American man had left suddenly in the middle of the night, taking only a small suitcase and leaving behind most of his possessions. The abandoned cottage yielded few clues about its former occupant, but investigators did find something that sent shockwaves through the Henderson case. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a small metal box containing newspaper clippings about the sisters' disappearance, along with photographs that appeared to have been taken during their final flight to Portland. The photos showed the sisters working in the aircraft cabin, unaware that they were being watched and documented. The discovery of the photos confirmed investigators' worst fears about the premeditated nature of the crime. Torino or his associates had been tracking the Henderson sisters' movements and planning their elimination well before the trip to Portland. The sisters had been marked for death the moment Sarah had discovered evidence of the smuggling operation, and their fate had been sealed days before they ever set foot in Oregon. Analysis of the photographs revealed additional disturbing details. The images had been taken with a long-range lens, suggesting that the photographer had been conducting surveillance from a distance. Date stamps on the photos indicated they had been taken during multiple flights over several weeks, showing that the sisters had been under observation for an extended period before their disappearance. The metal box also contained handwritten notes that appeared to be surveillance reports documenting the sisters' daily routines, their work schedules, and even personal details about their lives outside of work. The level of detail was chilling, showing that their stalker had learned their habits, their favorite restaurants, and the routes they took between their apartment and the airport. One note in particular stood out to investigators. Written in what appeared to be Torino's handwriting, it read, "The oldest one is getting too curious. All three need to disappear together to make it look like they ran away. Make sure the uniforms are found eventually, so everyone knows what happens to people who ask too many questions." The note provided definitive proof that the Henderson sisters had been murdered as part of a calculated plan to protect the smuggling operation. It also explained why their uniforms had been buried separately from their bodies. Torino had wanted their deaths to serve as a warning to other Pacific Airlines employees who might be tempted to expose the criminal activity. FBI agents intensified their search for Torino, following leads that took them from Mexico to Central America and beyond. The man seemed to have an endless supply of false identities and safe houses, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Each time investigators thought they had found him, he would vanish again, leaving behind only traces of his presence and the growing certainty that he was still alive and still dangerous. The investigation had consumed nearly 2 years and millions of dollars in resources, but Detective Kowalski refused to give up. He knew that finding Torino was the key to finally bringing justice for the Henderson sisters and providing their mother with the closure she desperately needed. The case had become his obsession, and he was determined to see it through to the end, no matter how long it took or how far the trail might lead. The break investigators had been waiting for came from an unlikely source in the summer of 2005. A retired postal worker in Guadalajara, Mexico, contacted the FBI after seeing Vincent Torino's photograph on an international fugitive website. The man, Carlos Mendoza, claimed he had been delivering mail to a compound outside the city where an American matching Torino's description had been living under the name Victor Thompson. Mendoza explained that the American had always made him nervous. The man paid cash for everything, never received official mail, and had the distinctive scar that made him impossible to forget. What made Mendoza finally come forward was overhearing the man talking on a satellite phone about loose ends in Portland and making sure the airline mess stayed buried. FBI agents flew to Mexico within 24 hours, coordinating with local authorities to surround the compound. But once again, Torino had vanished just hours before their arrival. The property owner, a local businessman with suspected cartel connections, claimed he had never heard of Victor Thompson and insisted the compound had been empty for months. However, this time Torino had left behind more than just empty rooms. In a hastily abandoned office, investigators discovered a computer hard drive that hadn't been properly destroyed. The digital forensics team worked for weeks to recover corrupted files, eventually reconstructing emails and documents that painted a complete picture of the Pacific Airlines conspiracy. The recovered files revealed that the smuggling operation had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Pacific Airlines had been moving drugs, weapons, and even human trafficking victims between dozens of cities across North and South America. The Henderson sisters had stumbled onto financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal transactions, records that would have brought down not just the airline, but several organized crime families. One email exchange from July 1987 showed Torino discussing the Portland problem with his superiors. The messages made it clear that eliminating the Henderson sisters hadn't been his decision alone, but rather a directive from higher up in the criminal organization. The emails also revealed that other witnesses had been murdered to protect the operation, confirming investigators' suspicions about the pattern of deaths surrounding Pacific Airlines. Detective Kowalski felt a mixture of vindication and horror as he read through the recovered documents. Every theory the investigation team had developed was confirmed by Torino's own words. The sisters had been tortured for information about what they knew and who they might have told, then murdered and their bodies disposed of in a remote location that would never be found. The most chilling document was a detailed report Torino had written describing the sisters' final hours. He wrote about Sarah's defiance even under torture, how she had refused to reveal whether she had made copies of the financial records or told anyone else about her discoveries. Michelle had begged for her sisters' lives, offering to do anything to save them. Jennifer, the youngest, had simply cried for her mother. According to Torino's report, the sisters had been held in a warehouse outside Portland for 3 days before being killed. Their bodies had been weighted down and dumped in a deep section of the Columbia River, miles downstream from the city. The uniforms and personal items had been buried in Hillsborough as planned, creating a message that would eventually be discovered and serve as a warning to others. The recovered files also contained photographs that turned Detective Kowalski's stomach. Images of the warehouse where the sisters had been held, pictures of their final moments, and documentation of the disposal process. Torino had kept these materials as insurance, evidence he could use against his criminal associates if they ever turned on him. Patricia Henderson was informed about the discovery of the files during a private meeting with FBI agents and Detective Kowalski. The investigators were careful to spare her the most graphic details, but they needed her to understand that they now had definitive proof of what had happened to her daughters. After 17 years of uncertainty, she finally had the answers, though they brought no comfort. "At least I know they didn't suffer alone," Patricia whispered through her tears. "They had each other until the end. Sarah always protected her sisters, and Michelle always tried to take care of everyone. Even facing death, they were still together." The media explosion that followed the revelation of Torino's files was unprecedented. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the 3 flight attendants who had died trying to expose a massive criminal conspiracy. The Henderson sisters became symbols of courage and integrity, ordinary people who had risked everything to do what was right. Pacific Airlines had long since gone out of business, but the company's former executives found themselves facing federal charges related to the smuggling operation. Several high-ranking organized crime figures were indicted based on evidence found in Torino's files, leading to a series of trials that would stretch on for years. The investigation team used the recovered documents to map out Torino's entire network of criminal contacts and safe houses. They discovered that he had been operating under at least 12 different identities across 6 countries, always staying just ahead of law enforcement. The man had become a ghost, existing in the shadows of the criminal underworld while constantly looking over his shoulder. FBI behavioral analysts studied every detail of Torino's communications and movements, developing a psychological profile that helped them predict his next moves. They concluded that he was becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable, making mistakes that would eventually lead to his capture. The pressure of being hunted for nearly 2 decades was taking its toll. The breakthrough came in October 2005, when Torino made his first critical error. Desperate for medical attention for what appeared to be a heart condition, he had risked seeking treatment at a private clinic in Costa Rica using forged documents. The clinic's staff had been alerted by Interpol to watch for Americans matching his description, and they immediately contacted authorities after treating a patient with a distinctive facial scar. Costa Rican police surrounded the clinic, but Torino had already left after receiving emergency treatment. However, he had been forced to leave behind blood samples and medical records that provided investigators with his current DNA profile and confirmed his deteriorating health. The man who had terrorized so many people was finally showing signs of vulnerability. Medical experts studying Torino's records concluded that he was suffering from advanced heart disease and would require regular treatment to survive. This information allowed investigators to focus their search on areas with medical facilities capable of treating his condition while maintaining the secrecy he required. The final chapter of the hunt for Vincent Torino began in November 2005, when surveillance cameras at a private hospital in Panama City captured images of a man matching his description seeking treatment under another false identity. This time, investigators were ready. They had coordinated with local authorities to monitor all medical facilities in the region, and the moment Torino appeared, they moved into action. Panama National Police surrounded the hospital while FBI agents coordinated the operation from a command center in Panama City. For the first time in 18 years, Vincent Torino had nowhere to run. As officers closed in on his hospital room, the man who had murdered the Henderson sisters and countless other victims finally faced justice. Torino was arrested without incident, too weak from his medical condition to resist. As handcuffs were placed on his wrists, Detective Kowalski thought about Patricia Henderson and the 17 years she had waited for this moment. The man responsible for destroying her family would finally face trial for his crimes. The extradition process took several months, but in March 2006, Vincent Torino was brought back to Portland to face charges in the murders of Sarah, Michelle, and Jennifer Henderson. The courtroom was packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and supporters of the Henderson family as the man who had haunted their nightmares for so long was finally brought to justice. Patricia Henderson sat in the front row of the courtroom during Torino's trial, studying the face of the man who had taken her daughters away. He looked older and frailer than she had expected, a shadow of the dangerous criminal who had terrorized so many people, but his eyes still held the cold calculation that had made him such an effective killer. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Torino's own files provided detailed evidence of his crimes, and his deteriorating health prevented him from mounting any meaningful defense. Faced with the death penalty, he eventually agreed to plead guilty in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his confession, Torino provided investigators with the exact location where the Henderson sisters' bodies had been dumped in the Columbia River. The information allowed recovery teams to finally bring the sisters home after 19 years. Their remains were found exactly where Torino had described, weighted down with chains in a deep section of the river that had never been searched. The funeral for Sarah, Michelle, and Jennifer Henderson was held on a sunny day in September 2006. The cemetery was filled with hundreds of people who had been touched by their story, from former Pacific Airlines colleagues to complete strangers who had followed their case in the media. Patricia Henderson finally had the closure she had sought for so long, though the pain of losing her daughters would never fully heal. Detective Kowalski attended the funeral, standing quietly at the back of the crowd as the sisters were laid to rest together. The case that had consumed nearly 3 years of his life was finally closed, but the memory of the Henderson sisters would stay with him forever. They had died because they tried to do the right thing, and their courage had ultimately brought down a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for years. Vincent Torino died in federal prison just 2 years after his conviction, his heart finally giving out under the stress of incarceration and his deteriorating health. His death brought no satisfaction to those who had loved the Henderson sisters, but it ensured that he would never hurt anyone else again. The story of the Henderson sisters became a cautionary tale about the dangers faced by those who stand up against corruption and organized crime. Their sacrifice helped bring justice for dozens of other victims and led to reforms in airline security and oversight that continue to protect travelers today. Patricia Henderson lived to see her daughter's murderer brought to justice, but she passed away peacefully in her sleep in 2010, finally reunited with the three girls who had been the center of her world. Her funeral was attended by many of the investigators who had worked tirelessly to solve the case, proving that some bonds forged through tragedy can last a lifetime. The vacant lot in Hillsborough, where the sisters' uniforms were discovered, was eventually turned into a memorial park bearing their names. A bronze plaque tells their story and honors their courage, ensuring that future generations will remember three young women who paid the ultimate price for trying to do what was right. The Henderson sisters' legacy lives on as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming evil, ordinary people can choose to stand up for justice, no matter the cost.